Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's session at Concentric 2020 for Better Surveys, Better Products, and How to Create Surveys at Work. Today's hosts are Dan Zola. He is a managing partner and research director at Sway UX. Dan Zola's devotion to UX principles began nearly 20 years ago as a key player in the movie phone experience. Since then, he's developed digital products and led teams across a variety of industries, ranging from healthcare to entertainment. Most notably, Dan has spent 5 years at MTV working to deepen the emotional connection with television viewers and digital users. Ask him about his run-in with Justin Timberlake. Dan then extended his expertise to the pharmaceutical industry, working to provide a smoother experience for patients who are taking a more active role in their healthcare in the digital space. Dan is managing partner and research director of Sway UX, an award-winning user experience research and design agency that creates websites and mobile apps with a focus on healthcare technology. A recent graduate of Pennsylvania with a degree in English, Dan lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina with his wife and 2 children. Also joining Dan today is Kerry Thompson, co-founder and CEO at Sway UX. Kerry is an award-winning designer who has been researching, designing, and architecting web and mobile experiences for over 20 years. She is obsessed with digital products and the people who use them. She's led to UX and creative efforts for national and global entities in finance, biopharma, and healthcare. Her past work includes a wide range of clients, including GlaxoSmithKline, Fidelity Investments, and Emily's List. All right, Dan, it's over to you. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, Randy. I'm in turn going to pass it over to Kerry, who's going to kick us off. Thanks very much for that great introduction.
Yeah, it's a great introduction. So we're glad you could join us today. Today we're going to talk about making surveys that work.
So when we talk about surveys that work, we mean a few things, really. We mean, first of all, that more people are taking your survey, higher response rates, more data. Secondly, we mean that the data that comes back is accurate. You can trust that it is correct. And thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, we mean that the data that comes back is actionable. It's the exact information that you need in order to improve your product, your process, or web presence. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Here's a brief agenda. Thank you again, Randy, for such a great introduction. We'll spend the bulk of our time looking at survey best practices, how to conduct a survey, how to construct a survey, do's and don'ts, what questions to ask, what questions not to ask, and give you some real practical and tactical how-tos. Next, we'll spend some time looking at real-world examples. These are actual survey questions that Kerry and I have conducted over the years for real clients, real products. We'll talk about how the questions were constructed, why they were written that way, that we'll see the data that comes back, and most importantly, how that data influenced the product. And then time permitting, we'll take your questions. So we'll jump in. I'll say that these are pictures of me and Kerry. But other than that, we'll breeze through the introduction again because of such a great intro provided by Randy. Thank you. And we'll start and we'll look at survey best practices.
Yep. So let's start by talking about what a user survey is, just so we all know we're on the same page. So when we talk about a user survey today, we're talking about a questionnaire that was specifically designed to collect the thoughts and experiences from a larger group with the sole purpose of trying to help inform decisions about your products, your processes, or your web presence. And the whole point of a survey is to get information from a wide swath of people, and perhaps you're just trying to illuminate opportunities to make your product better. Maybe you're trying to learn about user satisfaction. Maybe you just want to understand your audience better. Or maybe it's just that you need to really connect with customers or potential customers without having to be there in person to do one-on-one interviews and ask people questions individually. One thing that we get asked a lot is about when to conduct a user survey. So let's start with that. Because the answer I always tell people is you can do a user survey anytime you need user input. So at any point in your project, you feel like you need more information, you can get it. And a user survey is a really good way to get it. And it's generally a pretty fast way to get it, which is why we love them so much. However, I will say that we do recommend before you get into any sort of new project, maybe it's a redesign, maybe you're developing a new product, maybe you're doing an overhaul of your internal processes. It's always a good idea to do a user survey at the start of that project. So I will say, even though you can do it at any point during the project, I wouldn't wait and do one mid-project. I would definitely do one right at the start. The second most asked question we get is, who do you survey? And we like to break it down into 3 separate audience options, and there's different information that you're going to get from each audience. So the first audience that I'll point out is probably the most obvious one, and that's existing users. So if you already have customers, you already have visitors to the site, people using your product, you know, you can learn a lot from them. You can learn how they're actually using your product, your process, your website. You can learn what features are most important to those people who are already familiar with you. You can get an understanding of what their overall satisfaction is with your service. You can learn from them in their own words what the value is that they see in you. And this is really important because you can also, from a survey, if you're constructing it correctly, learn the language that they're using when they're talking about your product or service. And you'll hear the theme of learning what language people use come up a lot throughout this presentation. So that's existing users. The second group is a general audience. And so these are, when we say general audience, we're talking about people who are not necessarily existing users or customers. These are people that are completely unfamiliar with you. And the reason why they're valuable and why you might want to survey them is because they're offering you a fresh, unbiased perspective. They're coming in with new eyes. They're not already familiar with you. They don't already have a bias formed. If you have sort of weaknesses, they haven't already formed, you know, their own workarounds in their head. And for this reason, Dan and I often describe the general audience as the audience where you can get the purest data. Because, you know, how a new person seeing you for the first time describes your value is going to be the most illuminating in terms of how effective your messaging or your product is. And then thirdly, you have the targeted audience. And the targeted audience is very similar to a general audience, but perhaps you are a company that is really geared towards a very specific industry. You know, for example, we have one client that only services class action lawyers. That's a very specific group. So we can't send a survey out to a general audience. We would want to send that out specifically to law professionals working in class action. But you can learn a similar thing from a targeted audience as you can from a general audience, because you're still looking for people who aren't necessarily familiar with you. So you're still looking at understanding how a fresh pair of eyes would describe your value, get a good understanding of the landscape that your product is entering, reactions to messaging, market gaps and opportunities, and just general comparisons between competitors. So now we know what a user survey is. We know who we should be surveying. We have some different audience options. And now we'll get into, you know, what actually makes a good survey.
And to talk about what makes a good survey, it might be a good idea to start with, well, what makes a bad survey? And there's a lot of them out there. I'm sure many of us have received them in your inbox, a long, boring, otherwise bad survey that gives you incorrect data. And that's what we're talking about. We're talking about survey fatigue. Users who are so burdened by this poor survey, perhaps it's too many questions, and it goes on and on and on, or it's convoluted questions that you just don't understand, or answers that don't line up with how people think. It's It's this idea of you don't know what you're to ask for, so you ask for everything. And you have questions that require long answers. Don't do that. Don't ask for a paragraph when a sentence will do. Don't ask for a sentence when a word will do. Survey fatigue, bad for the survey taker. And the result is bad for the survey administrator, the person who's conducting the survey and gathering the data, because it provides you inactionable data you can't use, right? Data that can be interpreted to have more than one meaning, or answers that are vague. Let's say I give you a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rank an item? And I come back with lots of 5s and 6s. What's that going to tell you? It's nebulous and doesn't provide you any new information. Another hallmark of inactionable data is straight line answering, something that looks like this. You've got a matrix of 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 ratings. They fill the page, and the user looks at it and says, I don't feel like answering this. This is too long, too cumbersome. I'm just going to go straight down a line. And they can be neutral or strongly agree or strongly disagree, but it's a straight line because they're bored and they just want to move forward. So we're going to avoid that. And here's how. What makes a good survey? Well, firstly, let's ask about one thing at a time. Pretty simple concept, but you'd be surprised how often it's not followed. For example, how do you feel about your salary and benefits? Well, those are two different questions. How I feel about my salary is completely different than how I feel about my benefits. Let's ask about one thing at a time. Use simple, familiar words, not technical jargon. I received a survey in the mail the other day that had asked me, are you happy with your PEO? And I said, I don't know. What's a PEO? I had to look it up. PEO is a new acronym, relatively, standing for Professional Employment Organization. We always do this, we often give this talk in person in front of folks, and we ask people in the room if they know it. And so far, no one has known that a PEO is a Professional Employment Organization, which basically means it's a recruiter, right? Recruiters are now calling themselves PEOs. So let's avoid that kind of industry technical jargon and abbreviations wherever possible. And stay away from 1 to 10 rating scales. If there was a theme, a subtitle to this presentation, it would be why we hate 1 to 10 rating scales. Instead, consider asking the question either as a binary answer or as a feature ranking. And let's talk about what each of those means and why we prefer them. If I asked you, for example, this morning, on a scale of 1 to 10, for those who ate, how would you rate your breakfast? So a few things are happening. You're trying to recall now what you had for breakfast, and then you're trying to give it a number. You're trying to ascribe a numeric value to this experience that you don't normally ascribe numeric values to. And some of you are thinking, well, maybe that's a 6, or maybe that's a 7, and if you didn't like it, maybe it's a 3, or maybe it's a 4. But there are a number of complications with this. One, how you might describe something as a 7 is different than what I might call a 7. And let's say I don't give out 1s or 10s. So it's really a scale of 2 to 9. And it's difficult for the user to give it a number. It takes time and energy to think of what, of what number I want to ascribe to that breakfast. What's more, it's energy on the back end for the survey administrator to interpret all that data. Well, let's see, 12% gave it a 2 and 14% gave it a 4. What story are you going to tell with all that? But if instead I asked you, did you like your breakfast today? Yes or no? Firstly, that's much easier for you to answer. You can answer that quickly. Secondly, it's great data, because on the back end, I can look at that data and say, oh, 86% of people like their breakfast. That's real data, and that's data that you can use to improve your product. So if it's about your product, your process, you get much more usable, actionable data. The other way to go is a feature set ranking. Let's say, hey, I asked you about your breakfast. When choosing a breakfast, what's most important to you? And you can see how, let's imagine the people ranked taste and nutrition and calories, and not so much interested in price or gluten-free. You can imagine if, let's say this were an actual survey question for your product, what your messaging, how your messaging would be derived from this survey question. When you land on the page, you know that you want to lead with taste and nutrition because that's what matters most to users. And you'd also know that you don't have to give a lot of real estate and attention to price and gluten-free. So you can imagine how a feature set ranking for your product or process could benefit greatly from a question like this. So stay away from 1 to 10 ratings questions. Also, avoid words with ambiguous meanings. You know, no one's there interpreting the survey for your users. They have to do it on their own. And so when you use words that could have more than one meaning or ambiguous, it's just a little bit of friction. It just trips them up a little bit, and that's what you want to avoid. Examples like own data. Kerry and I were in the lobby of a client, and they had a poster up on the wall that we designed. Own, and I still don't know what they meant. Is the word own a verb or an adjective? Is it your own data that you have, or do you get to own the data at the end of the engagement? It's just confusing. It's a little bit nebulous. Another kind of example, what to avoid in terms of nebulous meanings, abbreviations. Most of us might think we know what a CRO is, and you know we can list a number of them. Maybe it means to you Chief Revenue Officer. Maybe it means Chief Risk Officer. Maybe you're in pharma and it means contract research. If you grow, abbreviation. They introduce more unknowns than knowns. Be clear, be brief, yes. Don't ask leading questions. Pretty straightforward, but again, you'd be surprised how often we see this. Because it ultimately gives you data that you can't rely on. What's an example of a leading question? How short was Napoleon? Well, it was pretty short. So another way to ask this question, you can think about it, would be, how would you describe Napoleon's height? You're not leading them. You're letting them tell you. The next example I'll show you of a leading question is an actual survey question that we did not write, that we inherited from a client in another project. And it is probably the most leading question I've ever seen. It says, do you agree? Let's start right there. You agree, right? Don't you agree with us? Do you agree with the plans? We have these plans in place. Don't you agree with them already? For a program to be undertaken by a third party, it's an incredibly leading question. It's basically saying, hey, this other group should do the work that they said they would do, don't you think? It's a terribly leading question. The client ran it, again, before we were involved on the project, and it led to the development of this this program that the client felt was justified because so many people said yes. Of course people said yes. That's a terribly leading question. I'm always surprised at the 2% of the people who said no. So avoid leading questions. If you like to do screenshots, this is a great example. A good listing of the summary statement. And I'm sure you've already taken that screenshot, so we'll move on.
All right, so now we know what to avoid and what to include in order to make a good survey. So let's get into actually constructing the survey. What's square one? Where do we start? And this is where we start. And this is a slide that we often say is probably the most important slide in the presentation. Before you write a single survey question, you've got to make a list of objectives. You have to have a very clear understanding of what you want to do with the information you find before you even ask your first question. So some examples of a list of an objective would be, maybe you're just trying to gauge interest in a new feature or a new service offering. Maybe you already have a feature list, so an objective might be that you need to prioritize that and figure out what you want to tackle first. Perhaps you're thinking about a rebrand or some messaging, and your entire objective is you just want to learn how other people describe your organization's value. Or maybe your objective is pretty straightforward, just trying to get a pulse on the overall customer satisfaction. But the idea here is if you just go in blind and just start asking random questions of things you might want to know, you get sort of a jumbled survey and some results that you ultimately might not be able to use when you get it back. So having an objective as your very first step is extremely important. The second thing that's extremely important that we recommend people include in every survey is some way to have your audience self-identify. And you want them to do it in a way that you think is going to be meaningful for you. So for example, maybe you are a financial institution and you are sending out the same survey to commercial businesses as you are to, personal banking customers. Perhaps a question that you would have people self-identify on is to clarify whether are they a commercial business or is it personal banking? And what that would allow you to do when you get your answers back is actually segment your data based on who that audience was. So perhaps people who used personal banking services answered the questions entirely differently than people who had commercial accounts with a financial institution.
Yeah, let's say that you're a university and you're sending out a survey to faculty and staff and students and parents.
And alumni.
And you want to be able to segment all those groups. Or maybe you want to segment alumni in terms of new alumni, recent grads versus folks who graduated 10, 15 years ago. Any kind of segmentation, any way that you can slice the data. Segmentation is a great way to do that in a survey and compare and contrast the results.
Yeah, so just think about, as you go into your survey, what audience segments are important to you and make sure you ask a question so that you can learn that information. The next thing to keep in mind when you're constructing a survey is to make sure you're asking at least one or two open-ended questions. And we say that because this goes back to the earlier piece of the presentation where we talked about learning the language that people use. So asking an open-ended question, and you don't want an open-ended question that needs an essay, just an open-ended question that someone could reasonably answer with a single sentence. But the idea is that you want them to use their own words, their own language, instead of just choosing from a multiple choice so that you can learn what words people use. I'm sorry. But one thing we will enforce is that you want to ask those open-ended questions first. So don't save them till the end. Don't ask a bunch of multiple choice questions and ask the open-ended question at the end. The reason being is if you ask people open-ended questions after you've asked them multiple choice questions, that language that they use to answer the open-ended question is suddenly not their own. They're suddenly taking from the phrases they just read in the multiple choice answers and previous questions. And so it becomes tainted data.
Yeah, unfortunately, we learned this the hard way. In our early days, we had a client who said, you know what, let's start with those multiple choice questions first, because I want to ease them into the survey before I ask them to write a long sentence. And we were young and naive, and we agreed. But unfortunately, when the data came back, we were horrified to learn, as Kerry said, everyone's open-ended question answer was tainted by all the questions earlier asked in the survey. They used they repeated, they parroted back the same language that was earlier in the survey.
Exact phrasing.
And that defeats the whole purpose of asking an open-ended question. We want to know their language, the user's language, not our own. So be sure to ask open-ended questions first.
My next big recommendation for constructing your survey is to do it using an existing survey platform. So SurveyMonkey and SurveyGizmo are platforms that we use a lot. We use very frequently. And they both offer, a free level of service tier that actually has a lot of functionality. So if you just want to try it out, you can actually send out a real survey and really get back some data and slice it and dice it any way you want, even with just the free option. But of course, there's upgrades as well. But the reason why we recommend using a survey platform, sometimes we see people, they'll just maybe mail out a form. I think Google Forms is becoming increasingly popular for people conducting surveys. And that's okay. I mean, it's functional at a basic level, but these pre-existing survey platforms actually already have built-in tools that make it really easy to organize your responses, to slice and dice your data, and segment it any way you need to very easily and intuitively. So you don't want to spend a lot of time trying to reinvent the wheel or entering your answers into a spreadsheet or being limited in how you can view your data when you get those answers back. You know, there's no reason not to use a survey platform when that's available to you. And on top of all of that, you know, there's going to be instances where perhaps you need to recruit an audience, and going through a survey platform will at least allow you that option.
Yeah, we're not sponsored in any way by SurveyMonkey or SurveyGizmo, but we should be.
Next, you want to keep it short. So one of the biggest mistakes I see surveys make after basing their entire survey on ranking questions is making it really long. And often, and I'm sure a lot of people here have taken a survey where it seemed like the questions were really redundant. Some survey companies will tell you they did that intentionally, but truly at the end of the day, they're not actually getting better or more accurate data by asking more questions. If they simply understood the objective they had going in more clearly, they would be able to conduct an effective survey in 10 questions or fewer. So we always put 10 as the cap because we actually start to see a big drop off in completed survey responses once we go beyond 10. And frankly, I don't think we've ever had an instance where we needed to ask more than 10 questions to get the information we needed because we know exactly what our objective is going in. We're able to tailor those questions to that objective. We've had incredibly effective surveys that ended up only needing to be 1 or 2 questions. So if you have a survey that you're convinced absolutely needs more than 10 questions, one thing I would recommend you do is take a look at it and see if it's possible that perhaps that's actually 2 separate surveys, because in the few instances where that has come up, that's certainly been the case where we're really trying to accomplish too many objectives with one single survey.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. To Kerry's point, if you're clear upfront about your objectives and you know what you're trying to gather data for, then that will help you to keep your survey short.
So earlier in that last slide, I referred to having a response rate drop off. And I think that's the first we talked about a response rate, but when we talk about response rate, we're talking about the number of responses you're actually getting from your survey. So another common question we get is how many surveys should I get? How many responses do I need? And people get frustrated because I always say, well, it really depends. But the fact of the matter is it does depend. If you send your survey out to 10 people and you get 9 responses, that's an amazing out of this world response rate. But if you send your survey to 1,000 people and you get 9 responses, that's abysmal. However, what we can do is look at percentages. And just a standard across the board average percentage response rate is 10 to 15%. So at bare minimum, that's what you want to be getting is a 10 to 15% response rate. Anything below that, you really need to rethink your survey before keeping it out in the field any longer. That said, for us, 10 to 15% is very low. Our response rate following all these best practices tends to be between 25 and sometimes up to 70%. And the reason for this is that we've been able to refine our method, our approach over the years, see what works and what doesn't. And a part of that approach is actually sending multiple emails and reminders to the survey audience and making sure that we're allowing ample time to collect those survey responses.
And this is how we like to send it. So we recommend sending surveys, sending invitations, emailing out invitations to take a survey on Tuesday, then again on Thursday, and then the following Tuesday, for a number of reasons. Certainly, these have been shown to be the highest response rate days. People come into work on Monday, they've got too much to do and they're not going to take your survey. People are working on Friday and they want to get home and they're not going to take your survey, but Tuesdays and Thursdays, higher response days. And similarly, you don't want to send it to the best of your ability, time zones permitting, or first thing in the morning or at lunch or in the evening. So let's send it at 11 a.m. and 2 p.m. And you'll see here this rudimentary bar chart. And this is illustrating that when you send that survey on the first day, on that Tuesday, you'll get your highest response rate. And then following up with a reminder on Thursday, that response rate will drop. And the following Tuesday, it'll drop further still. And it's a classic pattern of response rates. It starts off high and then drops off.
Yeah, that's totally normal and good. In fact, we've actually had a couple people over the years have tried to say, oh, well, our pattern will be different. You know, maybe they sent a survey out and they didn't get the best response on the first day, and they thought, well, it's probably not our survey. We'll probably get more responses on the second day because that's just how our people are. And they think that they're going to be the special case, the special exception to the rule. But I can go ahead and tell you right now that they weren't. Nobody ever is. So if you send your survey out on that first day and you're not getting a great response rate, you're not going to make it up in the following days. So if you send your survey out on the first day and you're not getting a good response rate, you might need to rethink your survey. Perhaps it's too long. Perhaps the questions need to be worded a little differently, something. But once you do get a good response rate on day one, these 2-day follow-ups really help a lot, help round out the numbers. Another super important component of creating an effective survey, perhaps second most important after having a clear objective, would be making an effective subject line. Your subject line literally makes or breaks your survey. I mean, if people never look at your survey or never click the link, then they're never going to complete it. You're not going to get that data. And we've actually over the years been able to get a really good idea of what kind of subject lines actually entice people to open up and complete your survey. And one trick that we always recommend employing is including words such as invitation or reminder with a colon in the subject line of your email. There's something about this that makes people open and read the email. We get really great click rates on these. Dan and I have differing theories on why this might be. Mine is that there's something about the colon that makes it look like it's come from someone's calendar, and therefore it looks important. It looks like an appointment.
And I think the colon simply breaks up the subject line, making it more scannable, more readable. Either way, invitation or reminder with a colon tends to linger around in your inbox and not get deleted, and ultimately leads to a higher open rate and therefore towards a higher response rate for your survey.
Mm-hmm.
We have a few examples of potential subject lines to demonstrate what that looks like. You can start to see the pattern. Invitation, colon, tell us how you feel in 2 minutes. So a couple of things happening here. One, we've got invitation. Tell us how you feel is a great phrase of asking for feedback. And we talk about how long it's going to take. These next batch of surveys subject lines were written for the educational space. Invitation, happier students and parents in 4 minutes, where we have some kind of value prop. We're talking about how quickly they can get through the survey. Don't forget, people won't take a survey because they think it's going to be bombarded with 20 and 30 minutes, so we're putting them at ease. And again, we've got invitation. Following it up with reminder, maximize student potential, a 3-minute survey. And then again, reminder, 8 questions for parents of special needs children. So you start to see a template, and it's templatized because it works. And it leads to higher response rates.
Yep, we've set expectations for topic, timing, and we've got that colon in the beginning to catch your eye.
So again, if you're sort of a person who likes to take a screenshot, here is a good one. And we'll move on.
All right, so now Dan's going to take you through some real world examples. These are real questions from surveys that we've actually sent out for clients over the years.
Yeah, we'll talk about the data that came back and how it influenced the product. The first one is for a client that is software as a service in the hospitality industry, providing business analytics. And we asked, say, 400 of their clients, hey, what do you use this software to do? And it came back very clearly in this word cloud, which represents responses. The bigger the word, the more the response was used. And again, to Kerry's point about language, we learned what language customers use. They said, oh, we use this program for forecasting. We do our forecasts. It's very helpful for forecasting. Now, here's the funny thing. The word forecasting appeared nowhere on the client's website or product. They had that capability, but they didn't call it forecasting.
They called it planning, which was not a word that came up in people's answers.
Yeah, and it's that kind of disconnect that we're trying to shine a light on. You know, it's not about internal language. It's not about what you call it internally. I mean, you built this product. You've been working with it for years. You know its ins and outs. It's about what the users, what the customers call it, and therefore what the customers see as value. And here, it wasn't about planning. It was about forecasting. Here's another survey question. A different question, different project, different client. And this, we chose to showcase how you can segment the data. This client was a field service management firm. They provided mobile forms, electronic forms for anyone in the field to report back to their home office. And by in the field, we mean anyone, like someone who's fixing the HVAC or replacing termite stations or visiting nurses, people who are traveling in the field and reporting back. And this particular client had two really disparate groups of customers: small mom and pop stores and large enterprise clients, Fortune 500 that you've all heard of. And the client was concerned, said, how can we possibly talk to two different audiences with one voice? And we put a survey in the field to find out easily. Because both, whether you're large or small, you cared about reliability and ease of use when it came to purchasing from a field service management company. And so we were able to see that continuity after segmenting. And yeah, there were differences. Small companies care more about software integration, and large companies care more about breadth of functionality. But when it comes to the main message, you could speak to different groups confidently with one voice because you did the research. Here's a ranking question that we recently did for an educational company, where just like I asked earlier about ranking the feature set for your breakfast, here we asked them to rank what kind of functionality were they most interested in this software. And the software was for nurses doing accreditation and online training. And it came back incredibly clearly, you know what? I need to find and complete required courses. That's what I need to do. Secondly, I need to find and complete elective courses, where nearly 2/3 said that required courses was the most important thing, and elective courses was the second most important thing. What wasn't important? Gamification, scoring reward points for learning management software activity. What wasn't important? Communicating with other learners. And so think about this. If you're the head of product at this company and you see this list and you're talking about where to put your resources, you know darn well you're not going to put them into the communicating with other learners functionality. You're not going to put them into the gamification reward points area. You're going to put all your resources in making search better, finding and completing required courses, finding and completing elective courses, so that you're not guessing about what the priorities are. You know, because you've done the research. And the last one we'll share with you before taking any questions you have is an exit survey. We haven't talked a lot about exit surveys. They are fun, they are easy, and they are incredibly effective. This is an exit survey that we conducted for a major pharmaceutical company. Many billions of dollars in revenue. Nearly 100 countries in which their offices are located, and employees totaling over 100,000. And they recently, at the time this survey was deployed, went through a redesign of their website.
Yeah, that somebody else did.
That's true. And we were brought in afterwards because there were some rumblings that it wasn't super effective. And we put a simple exit survey on the field that had 2 questions. And this was the first one. Were you able to find what you were looking for? And nearly 2/3 of people said, no, I couldn't find what I was looking for, which in and of itself is quite an alarm. And so the follow-up question is, well, what were you looking for? And here's what they were looking for. People that could find the content were looking for job information, career information. And this may come as a surprise, but the big pharmaceutical company, their priority wasn't really getting job applicants. That wasn't what they built their website for, spent millions of dollars on their website for. So they didn't see the value in this, and rightly so. The 2/3 people that couldn't find what they were looking for, they were looking for data. Specifically data around the therapeutic conditions, diabetes, depression, Alzheimer's. They were looking for data related to the disease state of their interest. And so now if you go to that site, it has since been redesigned. The navigation has since been redesigned, and redesigned really in no small part to this simple 2-question survey, where the main navigation is built around data and the many therapeutic conditions so that people can find what they're looking for. So exit surveys, a great tool. I'm looking up at the clock. I see we do have a good amount of time that we can address for questions. So I'll open it up to Randy, if you can help facilitate and moderate that, and we'll be happy to take any questions.
All right. Dan, can you hear me again?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I never know. All right. I don't see any questions here in the chat, but not everybody's necessarily familiar with the Zoom interface here for the chat. Now, if anybody would like to ask any questions from these fine experts, please look at the bottom of your screen. There should be a little chat bubble, and you should be able to type in any questions you have there. I'll just get the ball rolling with, do you have any kind of more input on how effective certain incentives are to fill out surveys? And if so, what kind of incentives tend to work best?
Sure. That's a great question, and it's one we get a lot. And for surveys, I do not advise incentives. I think incentives are a tool that was used to try and convince people to fill out those long, arduous surveys. And you really just should be making a survey that's easy enough that people are willing to give up 2 minutes of their time to give you what will ultimately be true and accurate answers. Incentivizing people for things like user testing or something that's a little bit more involved, takes more of their time, more of a commitment, that's fine. And that's, that I understand. But for a survey specifically, I don't think you're necessarily going to get the best information or the best value by offering an incentive for people to complete.
Yeah, and taking that one step further, if anything, it invites people to take the survey for taking its sake, and therefore will speed through it quickly and possibly, more likely, give you incorrect data. Oh, I've got to get through this because I want to pick up my gift card. So I'm just going to click very quickly and get through. And you can see a correlation to that kind of incorrect data when you offer incentives.
Okay, great. Now we do have a question here from Alicia Frey. She says, earlier you mentioned that you could not use or should not use a 1 to 10 option in your question. Can you go into more detail on why not?
Sure. So it's kind of a layered thing. So number one, people have a hard time ascribing numerical values to their personal experiences, and it's extremely subjective from person to person. So you're not actually getting an objective view of how people are ranking these things. So for example, one person's 1 through 10 is actually another person's 2 through 9. And you don't actually, there's some people who never give anything above an 8. So for that reason, all those numbers aren't even weighted the same. The second reason is that when you get that data back, you don't necessarily have anything specifically you can do with a numerical value, not the way you would with the binary value. So if you said do you like this? Rank it 1 through 5 or 1 through 10. And, you know, your end result is a 3 or a 4 or a 5. Your action item isn't going to be as definitive as it would be if it said, do you like this? Yes or no. And the answer was yes, or it was no.
Yeah, and it's also much easier to interpret that data. You know, telling us, because ultimately this data is going to be used to tell a story, right? Whether, you know, internally or externally, or to higher ups or to users. And, you know, this idea of, well, this many percent, you know, gave it a 2 and this many percent gave it a 4 isn't as compelling as, you know, 80% of the people said, yes, I'd recommend you to a friend.
Mm-hmm.
And that's concrete data that you can use, and it's data that can be answered much more quickly and with less bias.
Yeah. So yeah, it's twofold. It's more difficult for the person taking the survey to answer that question, and it's the more difficult for the person reading that data to turn it into something actionable. And then it's not really consistently objective.
What else?
She thanks you for answering that question. I don't see any other questions, but I do have another question if nobody else does. How do you, people are afraid to click on links these days for good reason in their emails. You know, what do you do to deal with that factor? People afraid to click on links for security issues. Some people may be afraid to just click on anything, you know, in their mailboxes from something other than a friend.
Yeah, that's fair. So the way we get around that usually is we have the survey come from someone within the organization. So, you know, and like even when you're using a tool like SurveyMonkey, you know, you could set it up so that survey is not coming from SurveyMonkey. It doesn't seem like you're getting spammed from SurveyMonkey. You have some sort of contact in the organization that perhaps the customers are familiar with. Perhaps it's coming from a customer service address internally. Perhaps it's coming from, you know, the VP of products address. But there's some person who's kind of owning the administration of that survey, who's able to use their actual work address as the sender
makes
address.
sense. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Good question.